Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Rachel and this is Sui and we are from Foolproof. So earlier this week, we actually did this presentation for Singapore Design Week 2022, but we also wanted to record it in order to share some of these insights from our work with the wider audience. So yeah, today we'll be actually talking about designing mobile digital experiences for our elderly. And yeah, I'll just go straight into the genesis of the project. So I've actually been living with my grandparents for most of my life. And with that, I'm the dedicated tech helper in the house. So whenever I come home and my grandfather can hear my keys from the main door, I will see his head popping out from his room. And when he looks at me with the expression, I know there's a certain tech help that he actually needs. And in the course of actually teaching him how to use these mobile apps and mobile tools, I feel like I've actually taught him the same thing several times. And I've noticed that he has actually faced difficulties in retaining some of this information. So for example, I would teach him basic functions like checking messages or opening the photo gallery or using the camera. However, I noticed that he often faced problems with it when the path that he's taking has a different starting point from the path that I taught him. And then that leads him to be unable to complete the task himself based on the steps that I've actually gone through with him. So beyond that, I also noticed that he doesn't recognize icons like how us as digital natives typically do. So for him, the speech bubble doesn't really mean text messages or communication. And even some things like photo gallery, looking at the image of the photo, he also struggles with some of the iconography like that. So yeah, for people like him who are not digital natives, these icons are actually not as intuitive, and he's doing other things like memorizing how it looks like or the where it's located on the phone in order for him to situate himself to a digital tool like that. And on the other hand, I actually have my grandmother who is very similar to my grandfather in terms of way of life, and also of a very similar age in their mid-80s. However, she's extremely quick to pick on digital tools and mobile tech. For example, I've actually taught her how to use WhatsApp and send me voice recordings or send anyone voice recordings. And throughout the day, I might get voice recordings from her asking me, have I eaten? What have I eaten? So sweet little things like that. But I noticed that she was actually much quicker to adopt and learn these new tools as compared to my grandfather. So I think that really made me wonder why my grandparents, who are so similar in ages, in demographic and way of life, so different when it comes to their responses to digital tech. And I think that's when I actually took this issue to my dear friends to talk about it. And when we actually talked about it, there was in the height of COVID, and that became a little bit more pressing because we realized that we really needed digital tools to overcome some of the COVID barriers. So for example, I would teach my grandparents how to use QR code scanners to enter certain places during the height of COVID. And I was actually worried that they cannot do it if they are out and about on their own. So I think, yeah, that's when we actually talked about it, and we thought that there must be something more to these barriers that they're facing. And is there any way that digital tools can help to overcome some of these challenges and barriers for the elderly demographic? Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. So indeed, as Rachel has mentioned, the onset of COVID has definitely affected the way of life for many of the elderly in Singapore, especially since digital became the main way of life. And unlike many of us here, the elderly are not digital natives. So it really became very difficult for them to go about their day-to-day activities. So for example, if they had to enter a hawker center over in Singapore here, suddenly they have to learn how to use the QR code scanner, which is called Trace Together, just to be able to enjoy a nice meal. Or even things like attending online mass. Suddenly they have to learn how to operate this tool called Zoom just to be able to attend the meeting. And despite there being many government and ground-up initiatives here that's aimed at teaching the elderly on how to use these digital tools, we realized that there was still a sense of fear and apprehensiveness when it came down to using it. So this really made us wanted to uncover what exactly were some of the barriers towards digital adoption and how can then design come in to address these issues.
So we started off by doing a bit of research to uncover the problem space instead of just jumping into solutionizing based on our own assumption, as with all human-centered processes. So after initial desk research, we uncovered that digital savviness amongst the elderly actually existed on a spectrum from high to low. And we were quite curious about across this spectrum of users, what were some of the different needs, the pain points and experiences among the different digital savviness. So we thought, why not best to ask the experts in the community, and they were none other than the digital ambassadors in Singapore. So these digital ambassadors are actually part of a government initiative here in Singapore called Senior School Digital Program. And what they do on a day-to-day basis is to interact with the elderly to teach them how to use commonly used digital apps such as WhatsApp. So we spoke to 4 of them to understand a bit more about the different segments, and we found out about their behaviors. So let me take you guys through a bit more. So as you can see over here, we managed to map some of the common behaviors amongst the digital savviness amongst the elderly in Singapore. So starting on the spectrum on the left, you can see people with low digital savviness actually doesn't use any digital tools at all. In fact, they were very comfortable with using their offline or traditional methods of ways of life. Moving towards the middle, you can see there are 3 apps that's over here. So those are actually the apps that the people in the middle end of the digital savviness group commonly used independently. So this includes communication apps such as Zoom, WhatsApp, as well as basic government services app such as the QR scanner code to be able to enter places during COVID, which is called Trace Together. And on the highest end of the digital savviness spectrum, you can see that this group of users are able to use more advanced apps such as e-payment apps, as well as lifestyle apps like Grab, which is a ride-hailing app here in Singapore, as well as Shopee, which is an e-commerce app here in Singapore. So we then decided to target the sweet spot, which is the group in the middle, who were able to use essential communication as well as basic government services apps. So why was this so? Compared to the left-hand side of the spectrum, they were not complete rejectors of digital tools, which require a more fundamental change in the attitudes and mindsets towards digital. So this also meant that design had more room for intervention for the middle group. And on the other hand, compared to those on the higher end of the spectrum, they were less savvy, which meant that we were able to uncover a broader set of usability issues potentially. And by addressing these issues, they could also move up towards the higher tier of the digital savviness spectrum. We then went ahead to conduct a contextual inquiry through observations and interviews with 7 of the elderly participants that fit into our profile. And during the research sessions, we also conducted usability testing with 3 different apps that were used amongst the elderly, namely WhatsApp, the CPF mobile site, which is a compulsory pension program over here in Singapore, and lastly also PayLah, which is a digital e-banking and payment app here in Singapore. So before diving into the research insights, I just wanted to share some snippets of the research experience where we really understood the importance of trust and building rapport amongst the participants, especially because they were more vulnerable. And a little really goes a long way. So things like easing them into the conversation by starting off with like icebreaker topics, asking them how's their day been and what do they do in their day-to-day life really goes a long way. And all in all, we realized that beyond being our research participants, all they really wanted was a pair of listening ears for them to tell their stories to. And we also experienced many heartwarming moments, such as the one over here, where the participants we interviewed were actually husband and wife, and they actually brought us to a cozy corner over here along their housing estate, and even offered us warm herbal tea at the end of our research. So jumping into the research insights, we realized that digital savviness is not really about the age. In fact, when we were speaking to 2 participants who were around similar ages, One of them was able to use a basic feature of WhatsApp, like sending a text message. On the other hand, the other participant was much more savvy and was even able to use very advanced features of WhatsApp, like sending, forwarding, and even attaching images and videos. So if it's not about the age, then what could it be? We realized that it really boils down to one's willingness and motivation to learn. So how did this look like? So you can see over here, this was taken throughout one of our research sessions where the elderly participant was so motivated in learning how to use this feature on WhatsApp called starting a safe message that she actually wrote down the specific steps of how to start a message on WhatsApp on paper just to be able to remember it. Based on this, we then mapped out a learning journey towards how one's willingness to learn eventually leads to confidence in being able to perform a task. So let's take Zoom as an example. So for example, if an elderly suddenly finds out Zoom to be these awesome teleconferencing apps that they are able to use to be able to chat with their friends and family. And this really piques their interest and curiosity in being able to learn more things about what Zoom can do. So for example, not just seeing their friends and family, but also being able to change their virtual backgrounds or start a video call, for example. And how they learn is really important over here, where we realize the main way in learning is through repeated trial and error, where they will actually try different buttons on the app, for example, just to see what it can do, and repeated steps to commit it to memory. And eventually, when they find out the correct steps to be able to perform the task, they then gain confidence in being able to do the task independently. And this confidence is really boosted if they could have access to learning support and resources. For example, if they had the availability of a technological helper beside them, like their friends, their family, or their children, to be able to help them to troubleshoot if they get stuck on a particular step. So however, we also realized that throughout this learning journey, there were 4 main roadblocks that affected their ability to perform the task independently. Firstly, would be the lack of compelling use case and motivation to learn. So one of the participants when we were speaking to regarding e-payment apps actually mentioned that why do I have to take out my phone to scan the QR code to pay when I can just take out cash from my wallet, which is so much faster. So this really speaks to the lack of compelling use case, which then led to the elderly wanting to stick to their existing methods of going about their ways of life, for example, using a payment method. So as product builders, I think this is a food for thought for all of us to really consider whether digital would be the right medium for the group of users that we are designing for, and also consider on a product strategy level whether the use case of the product would be compelling enough such that the elderly will switch from their existing methods to adopt the digital methods. Second issue that we discovered was the lack of confidence due to UX and mobile issues. So one of the digital ambassadors we spoke with actually mentioned that whenever there's a user interface updates, they will be confused because the button doesn't look exactly the same as how it was. So if you could recall the learning journey just now where we mentioned that the main way of learning is actually through repeated trial and error. So they rely on memory to be able to remember the correct steps to perform the task. Whenever there was a user interface change and the button doesn't look exactly the same as how it was, the elderly would get really thrown off. And this issue is even more severe if the elderly would have changed from one mobile system to another. So for example, from an iOS to an Android where the systems looks completely different. So they have to relearn everything. So this was one of the prominent issues that we discovered. And later on during the design explorations, Rachel will actually mention how could we use some of the design interventions and principles to address this issue. So the third barrier would be the inaccessibility to learning support and resources. So one of the elderly we spoke to when we asked her how she was able to troubleshoot some of the errors she encountered on the phone, actually said that she would just give up and wait for her son to come home at night to help her with it. However, we realized that not everyone would be fortunate enough to have access to these support systems, such as the technological helpers in their life. And in the design explorations later on, we will speak to how might we actually help the elderly get the help that they need independently without over-relying on support. And last but definitely not least, and on a more emotional note, is the fear of falling prey to monetary or privacy scams. So this was a prevailing issue that many of the elderly mentioned, especially when it came to apps that were more high risk and contains information about their private information or even monetary information, especially because scams were very prevalent nowadays. So for example, on the screen here, you can see was a recent scam by one of the banks here in Singapore called OCBC, where actually the scam message was embedded within a series of authentic messages sent by the bank. So because of this, the elderly are really afraid of downloading anything or any apps that have to do with their private or monetary information. So in our design explorations later on, we will also speak to how could we potentially address this issue by helping them feel more safe and assured when it comes to apps like this. So all in all, those were the 4 main barriers towards digital adoptions. And in the next section, Rachel will speak about how could we use design to address some of these barriers that we uncovered.
Thanks, Ling. So in the next section, you will also see some screens, and these are the apps that we actually brought to testing with the elderly participants. So you will see that there is the CPF screen, which is actually the pension scheme that we have in Singapore. WhatsApp, which is the communication tool, as well as some screens from PayLah, which is a digital payment tool. So we've identified 4 key issues that we've noticed during the research, as well as the 4 design principles that we can use in response to alleviate some troubles or struggles around these 4 key issues. So without further ado, I'll go into the first issue. Yeah, so the first issue really broadly revolves around the topic of navigation. So often we see that these elderly participants struggle when they're actually navigating and they're in a nested point in the app. And that's when they actually don't know how to move forward or to get out of it. So you often hear things like, I'm stuck, how do I get out of this screen? So let me articulate that case in a bit more detail. So what you'll see here is the WhatsApp screens. And I think for some digital natives like us, this flow is pretty straightforward and we usually have no issues navigating to and from it. So in this case, you see the very first screen on the left, that's the main chat page where you can see all your chats. When you click into it, like if you click into Annie Edison, you can see your chat with Annie Edison. And if you click into Annie Edison's profile, you can see her details, her number, etc. So we noticed that some of these elderly users were unable to navigate from Annie Edison's profile back to the main chat layer. And I think that was because they could not understand that if you click back 2 times, you'll be able to go layers up. So in a way, a lot of their struggles around navigation revolved around the issue of not understanding this concept of layering within the app. So that prevents them from knowing where they are currently in. And let me show you another issue. So this one is really a symptom of the navigation problem, and it's the infamous death loop. And some of us tech helpers might have noticed it before, but let me show you how it pans out. So in this case, let's say this user is on WhatsApp. So if they click onto the image and from here, they are unable to go back. They don't know how to go back and leave this. They might click onto the home page and then they click onto WhatsApp again, but they still see the same image and they'll click onto the home page and they'll click onto WhatsApp again and the process repeats. And if you can see, the main reason is because they actually don't know how to navigate back to where they came from. And they actually keep using the home button as a way to exit rather than the back button. And then this leads them into a loop because they won't be able to get to where they desired to go to, but they'll just be toggling between the 2 screens, the exact screen that they're stuck at, as well as the home page of the entire phone. So yeah, this is a case in point as to how they're actually struggling with navigation. So I think we talked about navigation issues generally, but maybe let us zoom in on specific parts of navigation. So in this first case here, we saw that there were some issues in navigating the mobile navigation bar. And this example here is actually using the app of our local pension system. So a lot of these elderly users will actually want to come into this mobile website to actually look at their funds for their retirement funds, their home ownership funds, etc., etc. So in this case, we gave them a task to open up the navigation bar and to try to look for their retirement funds. So in this case, you can see that the user would have to click into My CPF, and from My CPF, they'll have to click into My Dashboards, and from My Dashboards, there's where they'll find their retirement funds. However, many of these elderly users were really stumped when they opened the navigation bar because they expected to see what they wanted to see immediately without having to click into it or for anything to be nested within layers or sub-layers. So with that, not being able to see what they were looking for initially, they just gave up on the task entirely, or they were just too overwhelmed to continue. So how can we actually solve that issue on the mobile navigation layer? So what we can do is to really try to minimize sub-layers and to put everything upfront, especially if these are key functionalities that users tend to access frequently. For example, all these retirement, home ownership dashboards on the CPF site, we can actually just put them upfront without having to nest them in sub-layers. And if that's the case, you might ask that this will actually increase the scroll length, right? But in our observations with the elderly users, we noticed that they're actually quite okay and quite familiar with scrolling, and they will actually prefer all the information to be displayed upfront, even if it requires a longer scroll length, as compared to having to click into different things to open up things to see in deeper layers. So yeah, I think all in all, if we could put more information upfront on the navigation menu as compared to nesting them in sub-layers, this would definitely help to ease some of their frustrations around navigating a mobile menu for the elderly. Another thing that we saw was on the landing page area. So I think when it comes to landing page, some of the key access points got lost too far down. And let me show you an example using the exact same thing, which is the CPF website. So if I'm scrolling down and I'm still trying to look for my retirement dashboard, I would still be scrolling, and after transactions, I'll be able to find my retirement dashboard. So in this case, when we actually did this task with the elderly users, they were unable to scroll all the way down to their retirement dashboards. And the main reason is because they did not know that the information was there. When they actually scrolled past the transactions, they thought that the rest of the page was going to be a list of transaction items, and it did not occur to them that it could be a different kind of information if they continued scrolling down. So they actually really didn't even reach that point when it comes to scrolling entirely. So this is a case in point to show that key access points can get lost, especially if they're a bit too far down the page. And so what are some things that we can do to solve this? So what we could do is to use quick and upfront shortcuts for immediate findability, and I'll show you how this might pan out in a proposed redesign. So as I scroll through, right underneath the fold, I'll be able to access this. And these are the shortcuts for my key functionalities. And by having a suite of shortcuts there, it's allowing the users to have a one-click access to all these features without having to click into the different layers. And this would help them to avoid any of that struggles that come with deep navigation. So really it goes for immediate findability and surfacing all these access points to them quickly and in a more upfront manner. And I think we talked about mobile navigations, and we also talked about navigating on the landing page. What about pages that have very long content? I think we all know that pages that have very long content tends to be even longer on a mobile page, and that requires a lot of scrolling. So what we can do is to have a horizontal subnav at the top that is stuck to the top of the page that will allow users to actually do things. First, get an idea of what are the content sections on the page, and secondly, jump between these content sections. So this will prevent the user from having to scroll and find a specific spot for their information. By using these jump links, they can actually quickly be diverted to the correct place that they are actually looking for. So I think overall, we just explore a little bit of these design principles to help with navigation issues, and they broadly cover the principle of helping the elderly find what they need upfront, so that this will reduce the need for navigation as well as the frustrations that come along with it. And yeah, I think it's exciting to see how you guys as product builders can explore other ways to solve some of these navigation issues within your apps and your products as well. So a second issue that we actually noticed is confusion, especially when things are not aligned to their mental models or things appear as they don't expect it to be. So it leads to a lot of elderly participants asking questions like, how did I get here? What did I press? So let's take, for example, these two cases. So if you look at the interactions on the left, these are interactions that the elderly participants find familiar. So it includes things like forwarding, replying, deleting, and they find these tasks easy to do. However, if you look at the interactions on the right, these are things that are unfamiliar to them, and it might actually stump them or not allow them to complete the task because they don't know what to do next when they see something like that. So for example, let's look at this QR code. So this QR code actually exists on our SingPass app. And this SingPass app is actually an app that is like our digital passport. It holds a lot of our digital identity. But if you actually open the app for the first time, what you will see is this QR code. And for the elderly users, when they actually saw this QR code on the app, they were unable to proceed. The reason is because they're actually very used to seeing QR codes stuck in the physical environments. And their response to seeing these QR codes would be to take out their phone cameras and to scan it. So when they actually saw this on the mobile app itself, they didn't know what to do because they can't do what they usually did of taking out their mobile phones to scan a physical QR code. So even though there's the word at the top that says tap QR code, the elderly participants actually missed this affordance hint, and they actually just didn't know how to proceed because the mental model of how to use a physical QR code was so stuck in their head, and hence this interaction was extremely unexpected and extremely unfamiliar to them. So what can we do to solve this? We can actually try to resolve the issue from the root of the problem, which is actually to just start from where every action starts, a button. So from the buttons itself, what we can do is we can actually pair visuals with precise copy so that the feedback as well as the outcomes are super clear. So if we take a look at the bottom left-hand corner example, so in this case, what you will see here is what happens when you actually send an email on Google, on Gmail. So when you do that, there's a snack bar that actually appears and it says send and undo. And these actually correspond to conveying the state as well as the possible actions that you can take after this. And if you look at the example above that, which is the two buttons, you're able to see that one of the buttons says add. And when I actually click onto the button, the icons and the text change so that they can also convey the feedback that I have actually done from clicking on this button. So that makes things crystal clear. And I think looking at the example on the right, this is a case that affects everyone, not just elderly. And I have definitely fallen prey to the deadly Zoom camera and mute button. So sometimes we don't know whether our cameras are on or off, or whether our voices are being detected on the session. And I think that causes a lot of stress. But what we can definitely do is to actually pair more copy so that the state as well as what happens can be really, really clear. So in this case, if we add in copy to say tap to turn video on, that makes it very unambiguous, and tap to unmute also makes it really, really clear. So if we could add these effective visuals and text pairing, I think a lot of ambiguity around the button on the feedback can be removed, and that would reduce a lot of confusion. Other issues that we've noticed that actually led to confusion was from micro interactions, and it's actually because micro interactions often went unnoticed by these users. So take a look at this example here. This user is trying to start a message on WhatsApp, and as they start this message, the feedback is actually that there's this gray star that appears on the bottom right-hand corner of the message. So this feedback is actually very small, and I think that's one of the reasons why the elderly users don't notice it. But in addition to that, it also boils down to where they are focusing on the screen. So if you look at this user again, she actually clicked the star button on the top, and that makes her want to look and pay attention to the top area because that's actually where she clicked to trigger the action. But little did she know that the feedback would actually come at the bottom of her message, and hence it actually went unnoticed. And because of that, the action was repeated multiple times because the user did not know if the action was actually done. So at the end of the day, nobody really knows what is the final state of the action. Was it done or was it undone? That leads to a huge question, and hence more and more confusion. So what can we do for micro interactions? one thing that we can do is to really make it a lot more noticeable and also more relevant in the context of it, like a little bit closer and a little bit more prominent to where you actually triggered the action. So for example, let's take a look at this. Yeah, in this proposed redesign, we're actually trying to make the micro interactions more prominent and also adding in some of the things that we talked about earlier on about like adding in more copies so that things are more to reduce ambiguity around certain states. So in this case, we've also said saved in start messages. And with that, the user will be able to know what's the following steps that they can do. Like if they want to actually find the start message, where can they go to find after that? So with that, making it closer and more prominent with respect to the actual trigger, we're actually trying to make these micro interactions a lot more clear and a lot more obvious so that the feedback is crystal clear for these elderly participants. And yeah, I think going back to that same SingPass app that we talked about earlier on, that's our digital passport, we've noticed that this app actually uses terms like external browser. And these are very complex digital lingo for the elderly participants, especially if their native language is not English. So in our testing with them, when they saw this word external browser, they didn't really know how to continue because they didn't know if there's any severity around this as they couldn't understand what the word means. And that's exceptionally so when this app is something that is quite grave and serious to them as it holds a lot of our digital identity. So quite a lot of them actually just paused or stopped the entire task and said that they would prefer to wait for their tech helpers before deciding on how to continue with this. So what can we do to reduce that fear or that confusion? One thing that we can do is to remove the reliance on lingo, especially if some of the language can get very complex, but to utilize familiar visuals as well as animations. So in this case, we are explaining the exact same thing of redirecting a user to an external browser, but we are not relying on any of the English so that we're talking about the same things, but instead, we're actually using familiar visuals like screenshots as well as app icons to make it very clear that we're moving from the SingPass app to their browser app. In this case, it's Google Chrome. So I think generally what we've talked about is ways to reduce confusion, especially if the confusion arises from a different expectation or a different mental model. And the way that we can do this is to use the design principle of showing the elderly participants what has happened and what they can actually do next, and to remove any ambiguity around this. And I think the third issue is something that Sling also mentioned earlier on, and that is definitely the reliance on external help. So I think a lot of these elderly participants actually rely on the tech helpers that they're very used to, and this causes them to not want to try to seek help themselves and be unable to complete some tasks independently and confidently. So yeah, I think there were a lot of encounters that we had where they actually said, yeah, I'm just going to pause and stop, and I'm just going to wait for my son till he comes back so I can ask him at the end of the day. So this over-reliance on tech helpers generally make them fearful to complete tasks alone. And I think definitely we also have to note that not everyone has access to tech helpers. So what can we do as product builders or designers then? We should try to make sure that these elderly participants are able to use all these digital tools and apps independently and confidently, and to allow them to seek help or the help that they need or the guidance that they need from the app, from within the app itself, without having to rely and wait for external assistance. So one possible thing that we can do is to draw inspiration from the Apple ecosystem. So this is what you actually see when you pair your Apple Watch with your phone for the first time, and you'll be brought to a very quick and succinct onboarding. But in this onboarding, they're actually letting you customize some of your accessibility preferences, like how the text looks like on the watch, as well as how bold the text actually is. And in this case, we can actually consider creating an elderly friendly set of onboarding in the apps or the services that we are creating, especially if the app that you are making is an essential service that might have a lot of elderly audience. So this will prevent them from having to go deep into the layers of the settings page to find out ways to customize accessibility settings for themselves. But it allows them to do it all in the beginning so that the app and the tools are comfortable for them to use. Another thing that we also explored is to actually use call outs to explain app functions in context. So in addition to that, all of these callouts can be timely. So how so? Maybe the app is able to detect when the user is idling or struggling to complete a task, like making repeated errors. And that is the perfect time in which the callouts can actually appear. And when these callouts actually prompt users on how to use certain functions, this will also prevent the elderly users from having to memorize every single function on the app, as this becomes a lot more timely and a lot more helpful. And in addition to that, when this help is timely and helpful, we think that they are able to retain all of that information a little bit better. And I think some other things is also providing alternatives to typing. When we actually spoke to some of the elderly participants, one of them actually told us that she is losing her finger dexterity because of health issues or because of age. And because of that, what are some alternatives that we can provide to these users instead of having to type? So first thing is to actually provide predefined options. So in these predefined options, we can actually prompt them as to how they can possibly complete the task. And this will help to reduce a lot of mental load as well. And I think the other thing is voice fallbacks, like voice recording or speech to text. And these things can go a long way in helping to reduce the need to input or type, especially when it comes to languages that are generally harder to input and type, like Mandarin. So yeah, I think all of these interventions actually go back to that principle about making the elderly users, or allowing the elderly users to seek the help that they need independently so that they can confidently complete all the tasks or use their digital tools alone, rather than having to always wait and rely on external help. And I think, yeah, we can't talk about issues of digital apps without talking about this, as this is a key issue that the elderly users have surfaced to us that always hangs above their heads. So it's really the issues of scams and falling prey to scams. And really, the complexity of scams now is so advanced that even some of us digital natives are also worried about. So what about these elderly users who are already not comfortable with digital tools? So I think first thing is the fear of scam, like I've mentioned. And the second thing that makes it worse is generally their approach to learning digital tools. So as Sing mentioned earlier around the learning journey, we've noticed that these users tend to pick up a tool by trial and error. So that means clicking in different places and observing their feedback and just trying the different functions or buttons on the app. However, they're actually very wary to do that on things like on financial apps or apps that actually hold your private data, because they just can't afford to make mistakes. And because of that, they don't have that security around the app, or they feel like they have not picked up the app. And because of that, they will then just not use the app entirely so that they can err on the side of caution. So in general, their fear of scams or their fear of making mistakes just hinder their willingness to use these financial apps altogether. But in this case, if we are designing or building products for the financial space, are there certain guide rails or safety nets that we can put in place so that we can give these elderly users a lot more confidence in using these financial apps then? So I think some of the solutions that we've explored is around providing assurance. So we can provide assurance around two things. First is when we actually collect their information. So on the case on the left, this is actually a quotation for an insurance, and that's when the user has to input a lot of their personal details. But what we could include at the end is a little CTA for them to click on if they want to find out how this information is going to be used. So this is really proactively assuring them around any worries or concerns they have around their private data. And on the right-hand side, this is an example from Airbnb, and you will actually see the text that says you won't be charged under the CTA that says reserve. So what we're doing is that we're actually providing more assurance around the next steps, especially if the next steps might involve money or transactions occurring. So in this case, Airbnb has actually put in the extra step to tell the user that clicking on this CTA wouldn't lead to anything very grave, and they can actually go ahead to continue to click onto it if they want to explore into the next page. So it's really providing them the assurance so that they can continue to move on around their next steps. And another thing that we can also do is to tap onto a user's personal networks. So for example, this is how Apple has done it before. So for, I think, Apple Watch users, they actually create this function where you're able to collect or to input your emergency contacts. So in this case, the emergency contacts have already been saved in the system. So if that's the case, what are some ways in which the other apps or the other product builders can then tap onto this layer of emergency networks? So I think some things that we can explore is to actually notify loved ones or personal networks when any dubious transactions or strange registrations have been made. And I think with this will give a peace of mind for the elderly users as well as their loved ones to know that there's still an additional safety net and additional safeguarding that they can have in case any errors are being made without them knowing. So I think overall, this goes back to addressing some of their key worries around scams or making grave mistakes around financial apps. And that's really around helping them feel safe and protected so that they can be empowered to use all these amazing tools in confidence and independently. And I think overall, through our research, we've actually noticed many heartwarming examples and stories with digital tools being at the heart of it all. So for example, there was this group of aunties and they really loved K-pop dancing. However, when COVID hit, they were unable to go to the community centers to continue to learn dancing with their friends and their instructors. So what they did is that they actually turned to WhatsApp, and some of them actually had to pick up WhatsApp as a new tool so that they can video themselves doing these dances and to learn dancing with their friends so that they could still continue doing the things that they actually love doing. And on the other hand, on a story that's a bit more on the side of vices, there was also this group of uncles that were actually doing lottery betting. So in Singapore, it's actually called buying 4D. So they actually always go to the physical kiosk to actually make these bets. However, when COVID actually hit, they couldn't do that anymore. And similarly, they actually created a WhatsApp group. So with WhatsApp, they were teaching each other how to get onboarded onto these lottery apps so that they can continue to make their bets. And with that, they actually started to share some of like their betting tips or like little gambling tips to each other, creating a very close-knit community to continue to do what they like to do, the things that they were very used to do. So I think overall, we've also noticed that COVID hindered a lot of these physical activities. However, digital tools could still serve as an alternative to bring people together, to continue to do the things that enrich their lives. And as product builders and owners, I think we want to also make sure that we don't let these groups of people be left out in the amazing things that we're going to create. So we always need to make sure that we design for these elderly users and think about their needs so that they can also be recipients of the features and the powerful things that we want to create in our apps. And I think in summary, let's just relook at the design principles that we've talked about today. The first one is helping the elderly users find what they need upfront. The second one is showing clearly what has happened and what they can do next. The third one is to help elderly users seek the help they need independently. And the fourth one is to help them feel safe and protected, especially around the issues that they are generally more worried about already. And I think we wanted to end off with this concept of the curb cut effect. So if you look at your roads nowadays, you will often see a curb being cut out. And that was originally designed for users with disabilities and wheelchair-bound users. However, many other users got to benefit from this. For example, users pushing prams, trolleys, luggages, users using bicycles or skateboards, etc. And I think in this case, we can see that when we design for disabilities, we make things better for everyone. And I think this also applies to designing digital tools for elderly users. When we actually take their needs and factor them into account, I think we would elevate the entire user experience for everyone, and it will bring lots of benefits to everyone, regardless of their demographic or their age. And I think, yeah, it's just really, we're just excited to see how this will pan out in the industry, how people will be thinking a bit more about designing for the elderly when we're a bit more sensitive and when we actually hear some of their needs. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. And this was such an enjoyable experience to do. It started from a passion project to an investigation and finally getting the chance to share this with the wider design community. So yeah, I am dancing Rachel. This is Sing. And we also have a colleague who's not here today, and she's Shuing. And yeah, thank you so much for your attention.